Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. To everyone joining us here at Sydney Town Hall, I hope you enjoyed your meal. I hope you enjoyed the physical nourishment, and now comes some intellectual and espionage nourishment. And welcome to those tuning in online. It's now my pleasure to introduce the 2025 Lowy Lecturer, the Director General of Security, Mike Burgess. Mike began his career as a collection engineer in the Defence Signals Directorate, now known as the Australian Signals Directorate, or ASD. Mike has served in many senior roles in the intel community, including as a senior Australian at the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap. He moved to the private sector as Chief Information Security Officer at Telstra. In 2018, Mr. Burgess returned to ASD as Director General before being appointed to lead ASIO in September 2019. Last year, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike's responsibilities are heavy and he takes them seriously. They matter to all of us gathered here in this hall. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mike Burgess.
Thank you, Michael. Former Prime Minister John Howard, Stephen Lowy and the members of the Lowy Board, Your Excellencies and distinguished guests. One of our distinguished guests this evening is about to change jobs, and two of them are newly minted. First, I'd like to acknowledge Andrew Shearer, Director General of National Intelligence. Andrew, I'd like to acknowledge your service, your support and your friendship, and I wish you all the very best for what comes in the future as our ambassador to Japan. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague Chrissy Barrett, the newly minted Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, sitting right there next to Andrew. Chrissy, congratulations on your appointment. And equally newly minted on the same day, I understand, the Commissioner of New South Wales Police, Mal Lanyon. G'day, Mal. Congratulations on your appointment. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge all law enforcement officers, both in the room this evening, across the country and across the globe, for the work that you do in keeping our community safe. And finally, it'd be remiss of me not to acknowledge the staff of my organisation. First, my declared deputies, so I can say who they are, Mike, Lisa and Gus. Sitting in the middle over there. They are allowed to wave and identify themselves. Of course, there are others in the room that can't identify themselves, and there are others across the country and across the globe right now who are working hard to protect Australia and Australians and threat to security. And it is my privilege and great honour to work with you all, so thank you. It's a great honour to be asked to deliver the 2025 Lowy Lecture. Frank Lowy's life is as inspiring as his legacy. He grew up amid the ruins of Europe, but built an empire in Australia and founded the Lowy Institute, a factory of ideas. He escaped hate and darkness choosing to channel his success into enlightenment. And while I'd never compare myself to Frank, I'm also an immigrant to this country. I'll never forget arriving in Adelaide as a 7-year-old, travelling from a dark, damp London, stepping off the plane into an Australian summer, felt like going from a black and white movie into a colour one. The vivid blue sky and vibrant colours of the city of Adelaide radiated opportunity and possibility. And I think it says a lot about Australia that a survivor of the Holocaust can become one of our most successful business leaders and greatest philanthropists, and the son of 10-pound Poms can become the Director General of Security. This gives me particular interest in social harmony, something Frank Lowy himself identified as one of Australia's richest blessings when he delivered this lecture in 2018. Community cohesion remains a great blessing 7 years later, but it is under siege, under threat, and under attack. Our social fabric is fraying in ways we have never experienced before, and this is not an accident. Tonight, I will explore how the security threats are damaging our cohesion and how a damaged cohesion is amplifying security threats. Given this is the Lowy Lecture, I'll start with the international dynamics. ASIO is sometimes called Australia's domestic spy agency. This is not accurate. Our mission is to protect Australians from security threats wherever they are, at home and abroad. We have offices in multiple countries and working relationships with literally of hundreds of intelligence and security agencies. Some you would expect, some I know you would find more surprising. Our officers routinely conduct operations offshore to defend Australia's interests. A recent example involved a foreign intelligence service that keeps ASIO very busy, despite claiming it does not spy on us. One of its teams tried to cultivate and recruit several Australians and believed it had convinced them to betray their country. Reflecting ASIO's success in making Australia an unwelcome environment for espionage, this foreign intelligence service arranged for the Australian to travel by plane and then a boat to a third country for a face-to-face meeting. The spies wanted to hand over a list of their intelligence requirements, the people and things they wanted spied on. Inside information on Australia's economy, critical minerals and AUKUS were high on that list. Little did they know, ASIO was tracking and manipulating their entire activity. We worked with a partner in the third country to deliver an unwelcome surprise. When their intelligence officers arrived at the location, they were not met by their target, they were met by an ASIO officer. The conversation was brief but pointed. We told them Australians were off limits, and we warned them we would disrupt their operations whenever and wherever we chose. And of course, we sent our regards to the head of their service. Spies are meant to report any interaction with counterparts from another country. I'm pleased to note these intelligence officers followed the rules and owned up to their superiors. Their cover and their operation were blown. An international perspective is more important than ever before because in a hyper-connected world, almost every domestic security threat involves an overseas nexus. Australia is not an island. Australia is an island, but we are not isolated. The tyranny of distance does not make tyranny distant. Putin's invasion of Ukraine prompted a more aggressive and reckless Russian intelligence apparatus to target Ukraine supporters around the world, including Australia. Russia has always been a significant espionage threat. Ben Chifley founded ASIO to counter it, but the ongoing war with Ukraine added urgency to its intelligence gathering. Last year, 2 Russian-born Australian citizens were arrested and charged with an espionage-related offence. Russia's brazen acts of sabotage in Europe demonstrated its willingness to use a wider range of tools and tactics to coerce, intimidate and damage perceived adversaries. And we should not assume Australia is immune. Nor can we blithely hope that parts of its intelligence apparatus that are specialised in sowing division and spreading disinformation will ignore us. I'll return to this form of Russian foreign interference soon. The conflict in the Middle East also reshaped Australia's security environment from afar. While the conflict did not directly inspire terrorism here, it prompted, promoted protest, exacerbated tension, undermined social cohesion and elevated intolerance. This in turn made acts of politically motivated violence more likely. Even if the ceasefire holds, we expect ongoing tests to our social cohesion. Inflammatory rhetoric, provocative, disruptive actions have been normalised, and I fear normalisation of violence and hatred against one community created a permissive environment for similar behaviours in other countries, behaviours in other communities. Great power competition in our region is contributing to multiple territorial disputes, including in the South China Sea, Kashmir, the Taiwan Straits and the Korean Peninsula, while also driving a relentless hunger for strategic advantage and an insatiable appetite for inside information. This is why, based on what ASIO is seeing, more Australians are being targeted for espionage and foreign interference than ever before. At the same time, all three of these international drivers are being accelerated by rapid advances in technology. In terms of social cohesion, the internet is the greatest incubator of grievance narratives and conspiracy theories. It's an echo chamber for disaffection, misinformation, and reinforcement. And while the internet incubates, social media accelerates. If you engage with hardline but non-violent religious content on one of the most popular platforms, its algorithms will serve up more and more extreme material until, after just a few clicks, you'll be watching grotesque ISIS propaganda. And while the internet incubates and social media accelerates, artificial intelligence exacerbates. You will not be surprised to know that I am deeply concerned about the potential for AI to take online radicalisation and disinformation to entirely new levels. The result of these compounding dynamics is a domestic security environment with an unprecedented number of challenges and an unprecedented cumulative level of potential harm. Australia has never faced so many different threats at scale at once. And these dynamics are putting unprecedented strain on our social fabric, the fabric Frank Lowy helped weave and preserve. Fractured community cohesion is not one of the specific matters ASIO is empowered to investigate, but it is directly linked to our three most pressing security concerns: espionage, foreign interference, and politically motivated violence. It aggravates them, and as I'll explain tonight, they aggravate it. Of course, there have been other periods of social dislocation in Australia, starting with the most significant, the impact of European settlement on First Nations peoples. In the 1960s, 70s and 80s, for example, conflicts far away reached into this country with deadly intent. There were 16 bomb attacks against Yugoslav interests, the Anandamaga attacks on representatives and symbols of the Indian government, bombings of the Sydney Israeli consulate and the Hakoah Club, and the bombing of the Turkish consulate in Melbourne. But what we are seeing today is on a different scale with different dynamics. Grievance is growing, intolerance is rising, inflammatory rhetoric and behaviour is being normalised, anti-authority beliefs are spreading. There are multiple cascading and intersecting threats to our social cohesion fueled by three distinct but connected cohorts: the aggrieved, the opportunistic, and the cunning. The aggrieved are the individuals who tear at our social fabric. The opportunistic are the organised groups that take advantages of weaknesses in our social fabric. And the cunning are the nation states that play a longer, more calculated game to divide and distract us. Let's start with the aggrieved. Political differences, political debates, and political protest are an essential part of a healthy democracy. Unfortunately, here and overseas, levels of personal grievance and frustration are growing. Rightly or wrongly, some Australians feel dispossessed, disaffected, and disenfranchised. There are spikes in polarisation and intolerance. Many of the foundations that have underpinned Australia's security, prosperity, and democracy are being tested. Social cohesion is eroding, trust in institution is declining, even truth itself is being undermined by conspiracy, mis- and disinformation. Similar trends are playing out across the Western world. Angry, alienated individuals are embracing anti-authority ideologies and conspiracy theories, engaging in uncivil debate and unpeaceful protest. Some are combining multiple beliefs to create new hybrid ideologies. It's important to understand there is a significant diversity in this cohort. Suggesting all aggrieved are sovereign citizens, for example, is neither accurate nor helpful. While sovereign citizens consider the government illegitimate and therefore without authority, other aggrieved activists believe the opposite: the government possesses too much authority. Many of the aggrieved do not necessarily espouse violent views, but may still see violence as a legitimate way to effect political or societal change. The trend increased during COVID, gained further momentum after the terrorist attacks on Israel, and accelerated during Israel's military response. These dynamics have raised the temperature of the security environment, made acts of violence more likely, and continue to undermine social cohesion. Next, the opportunistic. Extremist organisations, whether religiously or ideologically motivated, are adaptive and patient. They are skilled at exploiting gaps and fissures in social cohesion, harnessing and harvesting grievances. The way nationalist and racist violent extremists attempted to leverage the so-called March for Australia rallies is a case in point. The biggest neo-Nazi group, the National Socialist Network, or White Australia as it is rebranding itself, identified the demonstrations as a vehicle to raise its profile. It strategically and opportunistically exploited the organisers' complaints about immigration and the cost of living. This is a key part of the network's broader strategy to mainstream and expand its movement by focusing on issues with broader appeal. Modern neo-Nazis crave attention and publicity. It gives them credibility and helps with recruitment. They see journalists as useful idiots in this regard, and they celebrate even the most critical coverage because it inevitably leads to a surge in membership applications. After one recent story, members joked about thanking the media for the 3 promotion. At the same time, though, its ideology and its provocative, offensive and high-profile actions are antithetical to social cohesion. At its core, the National Socialist Network is anti-immigrant, anti-Indigenous, anti-gay, anti-Jew, anti-Islam and anti-anything that does not fit with its white Anglo-centric worldview. Its version of social cohesion is monochrome and monocultural. And even if the organisation does not engage in terrorism, I remain deeply concerned by its hateful, divisive rhetoric and increasingly violent propaganda, and the growing likelihood that these things will prompt spontaneous violence, particularly in response to perceived provocation. While nationalists and racist violent extremists make up a significant majority of our investigations into ideologically motivated extremism, events in the Middle East triggered a troubling increase in anarchist and revolutionary extremism, which is also straining our cohesion. Since October 23, we've seen more provocative protests and a notable uptick in intentionally disruptive and damaging techniques by anti-Israel activists, acts of arson, vandalism and violent protest against defence companies accused of supplying weapon components. These groups, for want of a better word, are not as centrally controlled, uniformly motivated or as disciplined as the National Socialist Network. But they contain individuals who are increasingly willing to embrace or threaten violence to achieve their goals. Directly or indirectly, their actions can marginalise, stigmatise and threaten sections of the community. The group involved in at least one incident produced a video threatening consequences for the employees of the business. Every worker in the supply chain is complicit, the video stated. We will decide your fate as you have decided the fate of millions. We have been closely watching you. We have your addresses. Stop harming Israel or else. Ideologically motivated groups are not the only opportunists threatening community cohesion. While an entity such as Hizb ut-Tahrir is religiously motivated, its provocative behaviour, offensive rhetoric and insidious strategy are very similar to the tactics of the National Socialist Network. The organisation's condemnation of Israel and Jews attracts media attention and aids recruitment, but it deliberately stops short of promoting onshore acts of violence or acts of politically motivated violence. Hizb ut-Tahrir wants to test and stretch the boundaries of legality without breaking them. As with neo-Nazis, this does not make their behaviour acceptable. I fear its anti-Israel rhetoric is fueling and normalising wider anti-Semitic narratives. While I do not want to overstate the threat from opportunities such as the 3 I've highlighted, let alone give them 3 publicity, they are further examples of the multi-directional and multi-dimensional challenges for Australia's community fabric. This brings me to the final cohort, the cunning. Of the three, the cunning is the most concerning. Aggrieved individuals clawing at our social fabric is one thing. Extremist groups opportunistically undermining it is another. But the cunning nation states deliberately trying to set the fabric alight and fan the flames is something else, again in terms of threat. Regimes are operating in a security grey zone, using non-traditional tools to interfere in decision-making, promote discord, amplify distrust, and spread false narratives in Western democracies. This is a newer and more disturbing dynamic, and why I say the threats facing our social cohesion are unprecedented. Authoritarian regimes demonstrates a chilling willingness to exploit our fault lines in countries they consider hostile. In January this year, Frank Lowy posed a question that I noted with great interest. Could, and I'll quote Frank directly, dark forces financed by international hatred be behind Australia's spate of anti-Semitic incidents? In August, the Prime Minister revealed our assessment that Iran directed at least 2 of the attacks on Jewish interests. The Iranian regime used a complex web of cutouts to hide its involvement, while the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, provided instructions on the entities to target and its preferred methodology, arson. It is unlikely the individuals at the end of the supply chain, those literally lighting the fires, knew about the IRGC's involvement. It's important to understand that Iran did not single Australia out. The summer of anti-Semitism was part of its global effort to foment hatred of the Jewish community and fan the flames of division. This activity is perhaps the most egregious example of a nation-state trying to unpick our social fabric, but not the only example. In our region, ASIO is tracking the spread of a particular strain of extremist propaganda. While this material purports to be from a transnational terrorist group, ASIO and our international partners suspect it's fake, and it is actually being created and disseminated by a hostile nation-state. The propaganda glorifies violent extremism and advocates attacks on specific targets, presumably to encourage violence, alarm communities, incite sectarianism, and destabilise regional governments. In Europe, Russian cyber operatives connected to intelligence services have inflamed community tensions by spreading false news and promoting violent narratives, particularly on the topic of immigration. Australia is not immune. Russian operatives are covertly stoking and amplifying division here too, although with far less success. We recently uncovered links between pro-Russian influences in Australia and an offshore media organisation that almost certainly receives direction from Russian intelligence. The Australians publish and push extreme online narratives justifying the invasion of Ukraine and condemning Australia's support for Kiev, deliberately hiding their connection to Moscow and the likely instruction from Moscow. The propagandists tried to hijack and inflame legitimate debate. They use social media to spread vitriolic, polarising commentary on anti-immigration protest and pro-Palestinian marches. ASIO's investigation is ongoing, and we will be asking our partners to determine if any laws are being broken, because this behaviour is unacceptable. These state-sanctioned trolls are more than propaganda puppets. They want to turn hot-button issues into burning issues, tipping disagreement into division and division into violence. Fortunately, Australia is resistant and resilient, and their efforts are achieving limited traction, although again, this in no way excuses their behaviour. My greatest concern with these authoritarian tactics is that the regimes are increasingly reckless, seemingly unconcerned that arson could claim innocent lives, or fake terrorist propaganda could inspire an actual attack, or online vitriol could prompt violent protest. The step from a reckless act to a high-harm act is a small one. Given the degrading trajectory of our security environment and the growing willingness of regimes to conduct high-harm operations, ASIO assesses there is a realistic possibility a foreign government will attempt to assassinate a perceived dissident in Australia. This threat is real. We believe there are at least 3 nations willing and capable of conducting lethal targeting here. It's entirely possible the regimes would try to hide their involvement by hiring criminal cutouts, as Iran did when directing its arson attacks. Please note I said attempt to assassinate. ASIO and our law enforcement partners are acutely alive to this threat and are working around the clock using all our powers to protect Australians from this threat. In the security environment I've laid out this evening, national security truly is national security, everybody's business. ASIO and law enforcement are part of the solution, but not the full solution. You cannot spy your way to greater cohesion or arrest your way to fewer grievances. It requires a whole of community, whole of society response, and I mean that literally. Every one of us has a role to play protecting our social cohesion. Our words matter, our decisions matter, our actions matter. In an age of unprecedented, or an age with unprecedented avenues for communication, I fear we're losing our ability to converse, or at least losing our ability to converse with civility, debate with respect, and disagree with restraint. To have an exchange of ideas rather than an exchange of diatribes or slogans or rhetorical blows. To be right without being righteous. To compromise. Yes, the aggrieved, the opportunistic and the cunning are ripping at our social fabric. But in most cases, they are exploiting and amplifying existing discord. Anti-Semitism existed in Australia, sadly, before Iran directed its arson attacks. And while Iran is responsible for at least 2 of the incidents, it is not responsible for every incident. Yes, social media algorithms are accelerating extremism and radicalisation, but the algorithms do not operate in isolation. People choose to create the content, people choose to engage with the content, and people choose to act on the content. I worry we risk creating real-world aggro-rhythms where grievance, intolerance, polarisation and rhetoric feed on themselves, inflaming grievance, intolerance, polarisation and rhetoric, increasing the potential for violence. Sociologists will be better placed to ponder what's driving these dynamics than a spy chief. My concern is a more vulnerable, fractured and intolerant society means a less predictable and increasingly volatile security environment. Despite the scale of these challenges, Australia is better placed than many Western democracies to meet them. Our parliaments are sovereign, our communities are resilient, our economy is growing. These attributes, along with others such as compulsory voting and a social safety net, are critical stabilisers and insulators. While the threats and challenges facing us are significant, they are not insurmountable. Even the most cunning foreign intelligence service is not invincible. A national terrorism threat level of probable does not mean inevitable. We should not be defeatist or insecure about our security. We can and should have confidence in our ability to respond. Every one of the plots I've described tonight was stopped, disrupted, or pieced together by ASIO and our partners. We do not need to be security alarmed, but we do need to be security aware, security sensible, and consider the consequences of our own words and actions. Your business might not be in national security, but that doesn't mean national security is not your business. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot in there, Mike. Thank you for paying us the compliment of giving a very substantive and thoughtful Lowy lecture. And I was struck by the final line. Your business might not be in national security, but that doesn't mean national security isn't your business. It reminds me of the famous Trotsky quote, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." I don't know if you've ever been compared to Trotsky before, but...
I hope not. Probably have, though.
Look, I want to dive right in. There's so much in the speech that I want to try to squeeze in as many questions as I can. So let me start, if I can, with the most dramatic thing that you said tonight about the cunning cohort, and I'm sure that this will be leading tomorrow's headlines. And you said there are at least 3 nations willing and capable of conducting lethal targeting, in other words, attempting to assassinate perceived dissidents here in Australia. That's a very precise and very alarming message. Why did you decide to give that message tonight?
Certainly. I agree it is an alarming message. A couple of things here. Every time I speak publicly, it's not because that's just a fancy of me. I'm an introvert by nature, so I'd prefer not to be here on stage with you, Michael. No offence. But I take my job seriously, and one of ASIO's functions is to communicate our security intelligence and assessments to any such persons for the purposes of security. So that's not just the government that we work for, it's not just security clearance holders, it's every Australian. So explaining the threats to the people we protect. And I think it's incredibly important that Australians understand that we now live in a world where that is possible, something that people might not think is possible. Australia is a long way from it everywhere, but it's not from these threats. The countries that I didn't mention by name know who I'm talking about. We know who they are. By mentioning it publicly, I'm also putting them on notice that we know that some of you are prepared to do this, and we will do our damnedest to stop it before it happens.
All right, you did name Iran, and you referred to ASIO's assessment in August that was announced by the Prime Minister that the IRGC was behind at least 2 of the violent anti-Semitic attacks on Australian soil. Last week, you will have seen that the Mossad revealed the identity of the IRGC commander responsible for those attacks. Can you say something about that statement by the Mossad? And can you also describe to us a bit the kind of efforts that lie behind the assessment that you put out in August? How do you come to those sorts of assessments?
Certainly. So a couple of things. I note the Mossad statement, and I welcome that, and I congratulate on that service on actually the hard work to do what they did. It's appreciated. In regards to our work on assessing Iran directed at least 2, probably more of the arson attacks here in Australia, but not all of them. I'm proud to work in an organisation where our clever people worked from the bottom up to figure out that it was Iran behind this. That is principally all ASIO's work, and the men and women who work in that team and my organisation did a brilliant job. How we did that, you'd understand why I'm not going to share that publicly. Our secret sauce is our sources and methods that enables us to do something that the Iranians would have thought was near impossible. It wasn't. We're better than that. Of course, we continue to observe the impact the government's decision has made and the publication of our assessment, and we are observing some responses with great interest.
It must be tempting to reveal some of those sources and methods, though, I mean, because it would really make the night, Mike.
I'm sure it'd tempt many people, but every ASIO officer knows everything we do is run through a lens of capability protection, and that truly is our secret sauce, and we'll never jeopardise that.
All right. Let me go on to another one of those unfriendly countries, Russia. In Europe, Russian operatives have planted incendiary devices on cargo planes, they've severed submarine cables, they've plotted assassinations, including of German defence sector executives, all the while that Vladimir Putin rattles the nuclear sabre. How does the West deal with an adversary such as Russia, which seems to have no regard for international rules and norms?
Well, that's part of the problem, isn't it? When you have authoritarian regimes who have no regard, that makes it incredibly difficult. But I'd suggest this is the word of where partnerships and allies with great strength matters, because the threats that Russia was doing there focused on in Europe, principally the allies supporting Ukraine, but that same incendiary device threatened Australian cargo aviation, and thank goodness we have some great partners, including the US, who are able to stare down the Russia and actually see an end to that for now. Of course, Russia is Russia, and they will continue to surprise, unfortunately.
There was one country that was noticeable by its absence, I thought, in your remarks, and that was China. Why didn't you mention China today?
Oh, thank you for asking me that question. So, I did not mention China in my remarks today, you're correct. But how do you know I wasn't talking about things China did in my remarks today? So that's my first response. Second response is, We all spy on each other, but we don't conduct wholesale intellectual property theft. We don't actually interfere in political systems, and we don't undertake high harm activity. I've noticed something interesting about our Chinese friends. So I have called them out before on a number of fronts, and anyone's interested next week at the ASIO forum, strap in. I've noticed something interesting about China though. Every time I've done that, there's an army of Chinese government officials that go around complaining to almost everyone in this country across the system, public and private, but not to me. I find that very interesting. Interesting because if they were smart as they should be, and they are smart, they would understand a Western liberal democracy and the role and the statutory standing of the security service. We work for the government of the day, but our security assessments and our security action are independent. They clearly don't understand the system, because if they want to complain about ASIO doing its job and explaining the threats to the people we protect, including calling out China when we need to, it won't stop my resolve, it won't stop my officers from doing the job, and we'll continue to call them out when I need to. This evening I didn't, primarily because I was talking about things that tear at our social fabric, and at the extreme end of that, that isn't China, although we do have some concerns there too.
You said that the Chinese don't complain to you, they're too scared to complain to you directly, but that doesn't mean that you don't speak to Chinese interlocutors, does it? And I'm referring to the media report that recently, I think it was this year, that you visited Beijing in 2023 to meet with your Chinese counterparts. Now, I don't think you've commented on that publicly. Can you tell us anything about why you would undertake a trip like that? What's the advantage of speaking to the intelligence services, the heads of unfriendly intelligence services?
So ASIO has intelligence relationships with some 351 services, domestic, foreign and military intelligence, law enforcement services in 124 countries. Some of those are close mates, some of them are definitely not mates at all. Those relationships are incredibly important. You understand why I won't talk about publicly, confirm or deny, because you said it yourself, Michael, that was a media article. I'll neither confirm nor deny, other than suggest, yes, I do have some serious conversations with even those services that represent a threat to this country. That intelligence channel is incredibly important.
All right, let me come to the two other cohorts that you mentioned tonight, the aggrieved and the opportunistic. Let me start with the aggrieved, and I agree with you when you said that we're losing the ability to converse with civility and to agree disagreeably. I mean, this may seem like it's beyond the purview of a spy chief, but how do we reset as a society? How do we get back to a point where we're able to disagree with each other with restraint, without getting caught up in you called it the aggrieved, without hyping everything up? How do we get back to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer to that. I think we've all got to chip in. I meant what I said. This needs a whole of society, whole of community response. I've got to think about my words and actions, and I'm suggesting others need to do that. I think we need to actually know it's okay to disagree with someone, but it's how you do it that really does matter, and we've lost that. Behind that, it's a values thing. There's something not quite right with all our values. Now, there are many people in this country, and many good people in this country. There's a reset required. What's going to bring that on, I am not sure. For now, we should just continue to slog away and make sure we behave appropriately so we don't unnecessarily inflame behaviours which are antithetical to this social fabric that is so precious.
All right, well, let's talk about the opportunistic. You put a lot on the record tonight about neo-Nazis, but you also chose to highlight Hizb ut-Tahrir and the anarchists on the other side. It seems that the strategy of many of these groups is to stretch the boundaries of legality, to be awful but lawful. How do we counter organisations like this if they're not breaking the law, if they know how to go right up to the line but not step over it? How do we as a country counter them?
So it's again very difficult, isn't it? We believe in freedom of expression and everything that goes strong with an open and free democracy. If you keep pushing the laws too far to make that awful but lawful unlawful, you start to degrade your own society. It's really hard, but go back to the first one. What do we need to do to reset this? We shouldn't accept it. Now, if I can pick on Hizb ut-Tahrir again, we have to look actually at its core, what that group internationally believes in. It doesn't believe in the open free society we live in. It wants to replace this with a caliphate. How can we accept that? This is our country. They can do that in their own location. They certainly shouldn't want to do that here. Of course, others would argue people of certain beliefs are allowed to do that, which could change the country. Sure. However, the majority set the will of the country and the values of the country. Something's not quite right when we let this continue, because I really worry about that gives off the vibe that drives inappropriate, violent and threatening behaviours into our society, and that should concern every single decent person in this country.
All right, I want to change tack slightly because it's very unusual for this discussion. We've been going for 12 minutes and we haven't mentioned Donald Trump yet. So I don't know whether I don't know about opportunistic or aggrieved or cunning, but let me go on to the other side and ask about the President of the United States. Because President Trump has appointed he's made some unusual choices in some of his appointments in the national security community. He has appointed Russia sympathisers, it seems, to some key national security roles, and he seems to be seeking retribution against some of his critics, including a former FBI director and a former national security advisor, by prosecuting them. Now, I understand that this is probably uncomfortable terrain for you, but tell us about, if you would, your relations with the national security officials in the new Trump administration.
I'm glad you put the question that way, because I was worried where you was going. But obviously, I've just given a lecture on foreign interference. I'm not going to comment on the US system.
Okay, you're not going to engage in foreign interference,
I'm
right?
not, because they might perceive it that way. But to be fair to your question, I can tell you our relationship with our United States colleagues is as strong as it ever been across the national intelligence community, and with my agency, we have strong relationships. I have a strong relationship with Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, and our relationships are all about the business, and that business is about saving lives of Australians and Americans, and that strong work continues. That's what I will focus on. Countries will go through whatever they're going through, but at its core, we'll judge those relationships on the things that matter, and when it comes to protecting Australians, the Americans are great mates and they help us every day, and we do our fair share of helping them as well. That's the way it should be, and I've seen no change to things since President Trump was re-elected.
Tell me a bit more, or tell us a bit more about the Five Eyes. We hear about this more and more in the public domain. What national security advantage accrues to Australia by virtue of the membership of the Five Eyes? What do Australian policymakers, Australian ministers, what does the Australian community get because we're part of this international intelligence network?
Well, how long have you got? And I'm going to give you a short answer. Being a former SIGINTER, there's a history in the term Five Eyes, but if we just, it's misused by many people, but if we talk about the intelligence relationship, it's 5 nations that grew out of a trust relationship out of the Second World War. We trust each other and we share fully. Yes, there are still things we have to protect, but we share fully, and we as a country benefit from that. And as a country, we punch well above our weight in our contribution back to the partnership, so they benefit from this closeness. Of course, Five Eyes shouldn't be confused with a leadership board that says you're in the top 5 of partnerships, because some of our best partners are not members of the Five Eyes. It's driven by national interest in the security threats we deal. So the Five Eyes is special, can't be replicated, but that doesn't mean to say there are not other strong relationships that we and my colleagues in the national intelligence community press into.
Well, let me finish on that topic, on this question that interests me about the relationships between spy chiefs, because I was struck by the anecdote you told about the offshore operation where you substituted an ASIO officer for the target, and at the end you your officer told the agents on the other side to pass on your regards to their head of their service. And that had a certain flair to it, Mike. What is it? Tell us about these meetings between spy chiefs, both whether it's with friendly services or unfriendly services or sort of frenemy services. What are the meetings like? I mean, are you like managers of rival football clubs? Are you, open the door a little bit, let a little bit of light into some of those conversations.
Sure, and I shouldn't say this in front of two police commissioners, but maybe it's like Mafia Don's meeting. Just kidding, guys. Look, in the end, these relationships are incredibly important. They allow us to have difficult conversations. I'll leave the world of what you might think it is to the producers and the novelists. It's two individuals or people from organisations getting down to business, having a hard conversation where it matters, being able to do that in a way that's respectful, be very clear when you disagree, so it does work. A little bit of colour I can give you. I can think of many times when, as an engineer, finds himself as the head of security service, and I've had quite a few pinch-me moments when I'm thinking, how did I get here in those meetings? Of course.
Like what's one, for example?
Well, I'm not going to give that away. How did I get here? But I've had, a couple of occasions where it's pinching myself going, how do I get out of here? Of course, I've got great staff, so I'm still here today. In all seriousness, it does work. It works for a number of levels, and I can give you, without giving the examples, two matters that I have been involved in directly with a foreign counterpart on various serious matters, and both matters were resolved to Australia's interest. That's not possible without having relationships and conversations, even with the services that cause my service the greatest amount of pain.
Well, Mike, you began by saying you're an introvert and you'd prefer to be anywhere at the moment except up on the stage with me, which is something nobody's ever said to me before, so thank you. I did think when you said, how can I get out of here, I did see that look in your eyes once or twice when I was putting the questions to you. But notwithstanding that, you've answered my questions with great thoughtfulness and sensitivity. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the Director General. Thank you.